The shadows of Lincoln Avenue, nestled in the heart of a bustling American city, had always been known for its charm. Old brick houses, warm porch lights, and a community that prided itself on its traditions. Yet at its farthest edge, where the street met a dense patch of woods, stood a house that no one dared to enter. It had been abandoned for nearly 3 decades. No one knew why the Miller family had vanished overnight all those years ago, leaving behind an uneaten dinner, open doors, and a house that seemed to breathe. Some claimed it was cursed, others whispered about shadows moving within its windows at night. Yet the stories were just that, stories. That was until Ellie Morgan moved to Lincoln Avenue. Ellie, a single mother with her 10-year-old son Sam, had inherited her aunt's old house on Lincoln. Strapped for cash, she saw it as a blessing. But from the moment they arrived, she felt the weight of something watching. The neighbors were welcoming but vague. "Stay away from the woods," they said, "and don't go near the house at the end." Ellie dismissed it as small-town superstition. Sam, however, was drawn to the woods. One evening, while unpacking, Ellie noticed Sam staring out of his bedroom window. His gaze was fixed on the Miller house. "Mom," he said, "there's someone in that window." Ellie froze. The house had been dark and lifeless for years. She peered out, but the window was empty. "It's just your imagination," she assured him. But Sam became obsessed. Over the following days, he claimed to see lights flickering inside and shadows moving past the broken curtains. Ellie chalked it up to his overactive imagination until the night she heard the whispers. It was late, and the neighborhood was silent. Ellie had just turned off the lights when she heard it. A faint, indistinct murmuring, like voices trying to be heard through water. She strained to listen, her heart pounding. The sound seemed to be coming from Sam's room. She rushed in to find him sitting upright in bed, eyes wide with terror. "They're calling me," he whispered. "They said they need me to help them." Ellie's blood ran cold. She tried to console him, but he refused to sleep alone after that night. The next day, she decided to investigate. She approached the Miller house, ignoring the way the air grew colder as she neared it. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking as if inviting her in. Inside, the air was thick and oppressive, carrying a strange metallic scent. The house was eerily untouched, as if frozen in time. A dining table still held dusty plates of rotted food. Children's toys lay scattered in the living room. And then she noticed the photographs on the mantel, family portraits of the Millers. Ellie gasped. In each photo, there was an extra figure, barely visible at first but becoming more distinct in the later images. A shadowy figure standing just behind them, its eyes hollow and glowing faintly. She stumbled out of the house, her mind racing. That night, the whispers grew louder, turning into muffled cries. Sam seemed to fall into a trance, mumbling about the shadows and their hunger. Ellie decided they needed to leave, but the shadows wouldn't let them go. As Ellie packed their bags, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, save for the pale moonlight streaming through the windows. And then she saw them, shadows slipping across the walls, independent of any light source. They moved with purpose, growing darker and more defined. The whispers turned into screams. Sam's voice joined them. Ellie rushed to his room, finding him standing by the window, pointing at the Miller house. "They're here," he said. Before she could react, the shadows engulfed him, pulling him into the darkness. Ellie screamed, grabbing at him, but her hands passed through the shadows as if they were smoke. Sam vanished. The next thing Ellie knew, she was waking up in a hospital. A neighbor had found her unconscious on the porch, but there was no sign of Sam. The police conducted a search, but he was never found. Ellie stayed in the neighborhood for weeks, desperate for answers. She combed through old records and discovered the truth. Every family that lived near the Miller house had lost someone, children mostly. They would disappear without a trace, and the families would leave soon after, broken and haunted. One night, Ellie returned to the house. She stood outside, clutching a flashlight and calling for Sam. The shadows swirled in the windows, almost mocking her. And then she heard it, Sam's voice, faint and distant. "Help me, Mom." She ran into the house, ignoring the icy air and the suffocating darkness. The shadows surrounded her, whispering secrets she couldn't understand. In the center of the room, she saw Sam, but he wasn't alone. Dozens of shadowy children stood with him, their hollow eyes glowing. "They're keeping us here," Sam said.
They feed on us. Ellie tried to reach him, but the shadows held her back. The last thing she saw before blacking out was Sam's face, pale and tear-streaked, as the shadows pulled him deeper into the house. Ellie was found wandering the woods days later, incoherent and broken. She was sent to a psychiatric facility where she spent the rest of her days mumbling about the shadows of Lincoln Avenue. The Miller house still stands, its windows dark and empty. But if you listen closely at night, you can hear the whispers calling for someone new.
The echoes of Willow Creek. It was an unusually cold autumn evening when 29-year-old Evelyn Harper drove into the small town of Willow Creek, a secluded settlement buried deep in the heart of Montana. Evelyn, an investigative journalist for an online magazine, had come to investigate a series of mysterious disappearances that had plagued the town for decades. Her editor had handed her the assignment reluctantly, muttering about local ghost stories and superstitious nonsense. But Evelyn, always hungry for a gripping story, took it as a challenge. The rumors spoke of a ghost town where no one dared to stay after dark, where the trees whispered secrets and the wind carried voices of the lost. Evelyn arrived just before sunset. Her car rolled to a stop outside the dilapidated Willow Creek Inn, the only lodging available in the desolate town. The building looked abandoned, its windows grimy, the sign creaking in the wind. But the lights inside were on, casting a dim glow that felt more eerie than welcoming. The locals' warnings. Inside, Evelyn was greeted by the innkeeper, a frail elderly woman named Mrs. Delaney. Her sunken eyes and trembling hands spoke of a life lived in fear. "You shouldn't have come here," Mrs. Delaney whispered as she handed Evelyn her room key. "This place isn't safe for outsiders." Evelyn smiled politely, dismissing the warning as small-town superstition. "I'll be fine," she said, her tone confident. Later that evening, Evelyn sat in the town's only diner, her notebook open as she questioned the locals. Most were tight-lipped, their eyes darting nervously to the windows. One man, a grizzled fisherman named Hank, finally spoke up. "It's the woods," he said, his voice barely audible. "They're alive, and they don't like strangers poking around." The first night back at the inn, Evelyn settled into her room, the air heavy with silence. She opened her laptop, beginning her notes when a strange sound broke the stillness. It was faint at first, a low hum like a distant chant. She froze, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. The sound grew louder, more distinct, filling the room with an unnatural resonance. She walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. Outside, the woods loomed dark and impenetrable, their branches swaying despite the still air. But then she saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the forest, its silhouette barely visible against the moonlight. Evelyn's heart raced as the figure lifted its head. Though too far to see its face, she felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. The investigation, determined to uncover the truth, Evelyn spent the next day interviewing more townsfolk. She learned of a long-abandoned church hidden deep in the woods, a place where the townspeople once held strange rituals to appease the forest spirits. They stopped the rituals after the disappearances began, Mrs. Delaney revealed reluctantly. But it was too late. The forest had already claimed its price. Ignoring the warnings, Evelyn decided to venture into the woods. The forest was unnaturally quiet as Evelyn stepped onto the narrow dirt path. The deeper she went, the darker it became, the canopy of trees blocking out the sun. The air grew colder, and the hum she'd heard the night before returned, faint but persistent. She came across remnants of the church, a crumbling stone foundation overgrown with moss. In the center lay a large circular stone, its surface etched with strange symbols. As she studied the carvings, she felt a presence. Turning quickly, she saw nothing but trees. Yet the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Then she heard it, a voice, soft and whispery. Evelyn. Her blood ran cold. She hadn't told anyone in the town her name. The revelation. Back at the inn, Evelyn pieced together the information she'd gathered. The town's archives revealed a horrifying truth. In 1893, a group of settlers had performed a forbidden ritual to bind a malevolent entity that roamed the woods. The ritual required a human sacrifice, and when the settlers refused, the entity began taking people at random. The disappearances had continued for over a century, each victim lured into the forest by the entity's whispers. The final night, Evelyn decided to leave Willow Creek immediately. But as she packed her bags, the lights in her room flickered. The hum returned, louder and more insistent. Evelyn. The voice was no longer outside. It was in the room. She turned to see her reflection in the mirror, only it wasn't her. The face staring back had hollow eyes and a twisted smile. Panicking, Evelyn grabbed her car keys and ran out of the inn. The streets were empty, the town eerily silent. As she reached her car, she froze. The figure from the woods stood in front of her, its form shifting and unnatural. Its hollow eyes bore into hers as it raised an emaciated hand, pointing to the forest. The sacrifice. Evelyn tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The figure approached, and with each step, the world around her grew darker. She awoke hours later, lying on the stone altar in the woods. The townsfolk stood around her, their faces emotionless. "You've been chosen," Mrs. Delaney said, her voice void of warmth. The entity emerged from the shadows, its form monstrous and incomprehensible. As it descended upon her, Evelyn's screams echoed through the forest, mingling with the hum that never ceased. Epilogue. Weeks later, a new journalist arrived in Willow Creek, curious about the town's mysteries. The cycle had begun again.